Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome, magic lovers. Welcome to the Louisville Magic Club. Where are my Magic Club members at? Thanks for coming out, and honored guests and friends. I want you all to meet Thomas William Tobin, and he is what brings us here to Cave Hill today. And in just a few minutes, our Tobin expert, Jim Steinmeyer, is going to tell us the story of Thomas Tobin. But very briefly, just to give you a thumbnail sketch, Thomas Tobin was active in magic in the 1860s in London, England. He invented several very creative magic illusions that are still being used today. If you saw my show in Las Vegas, you saw me in my opening. I came out with a suitcase, I set it on a card table, I opened it up, and 6 showgirls climbed down. That was based on one of Tobin's illusions. Siegfried and Roy did an illusion in their show, I know, that was based on Tobin, as did Harry Blackstone and Doug Henning. So here's a man whose work 150 years later we're still using, people are still finding creative ways to use. And the mystery part was Tobin disappeared from the history books. No one knew where he was, what happened to him, what he was doing, until a couple of years ago when Jim found him, and he told me about it. We were talking one day, and he said, "Oh yeah, no, I found Thomas Tobin. He's buried at Cave Hill Cemetery in Louisville, Kentucky." I went, "Really?" He says, "Yes, I know exactly where that's at. My mentor, Harry Collins, is buried at Cave Hill. Colonel Sanders is buried there, and I performed at Colonel Sanders' 88th birthday party when I was a teenager on the Belle of Louisville." So I had this little piece of information in my head, and then last summer I was here for the IBM SAM convention, and we made a trip to Cave Hill one day, and it was me, it was Keith West, who's back here, it was Matt King, and it was Vinnie Grasso. The 4 of us toured around Cave Hill.
Fielding was there.
And Fielding West was there also. Fielding, yeah, we don't want to cut you up. So anyway, we toured around Cave Hill, and we saw Harry Collins and Colonel Sanders, and we visited Muhammad Ali, who was also an amateur magician, and we had a great time. And the rest of the guys had to go back to the convention because they had a lecture they wanted to see. But Keith and I decided, I stopped at the front of Cave Hill and I asked them, "You guys know where Thomas Tobin's buried?" And they looked in their records and they said, "Yeah." And they gave us a map and they marked the map. He's right here. And so now we've got the map, but we're kind of lost, don't know where to go. So the guy says, "Don't worry, I've got a guy over here, John Campbell. He's going to take you to it." So this is John Campbell right over here. He's the guy that brought us out. If you've never taken a tour with somebody like John that knows Cave Hill, you got to do it, because these guys know all these amazing historical stories and funny stories of people that are here. He brought us out, so it's John and Keith and I, and we're stomping around out here, and I'm looking at the stones that are marked and the lot numbers, and I'm marching it off, and we get pretty close. We actually thought he was right over there, so we were within 8 or 10 feet of where Thomas Tobin. But there was nothing there. There was no marker, there was no name, there was nothing. So we thought that needs to be rectified, and that's why we're here today. And I certainly want to, this was a group effort, and I want to thank first John Campbell, Bruce Napper here, who was in charge of getting this monument together. Bruce, wave to everybody. And Chris Rowan from Cave Hill, who's the CFO here. My buddy Phil Boyd was involved in this. Phil, I don't know where you're sitting, where you're standing. He disappeared, but thank you very much. And to say a few words here today, we have Michael Higgs from Cave Hill. Would you give him a hand? Michael, would you say a few words?
On behalf of the Board of Directors of Cave Hill Cemetery, it is our pleasure to welcome you to the monument unveiling for Thomas Tobin. My name is Michael Higgs. I'm the manager of the Cave Hill Heritage Foundation. Our foundation is entrusted with the responsibility of preserving the past for the future. and it is very fitting that we are able to take part in this event today. For the last 135 years, Mr. Tobin lay in an unmarked grave. He was literally forgotten about. His story was recorded in a passage in a book. But due to the generosity of a wonderful team of individuals spearheaded by Louisville's own Lance Burton and Fielding West and many others here that are standing with us today, Tobin's story is reappearing once again. So he's performed his grand illusion once again. In 1883, when he passed, our board of directors, according to his obituary, provided a space for him to be buried in Cave Hill. That was because of his prominence at that time. So it's only appropriate that we're able to permanently memorialize him today with a beautiful monument designed by, once again, Cave Hill Cemetery. Thank you.
Well, folks, here's the guy who solved the mystery. 150 years, nobody knew what happened to Thomas Tobin. Here he is, our own Sherlock Holmes, best-selling author, and our modern-day Thomas Tobin. This guy's invented more great illusions than anyone alive. My good buddy, Jim Steinmeyer.
Well, thank you all very much. It's such an amazing accumulation to this story. Years ago, I did a book, which was a book about history of magic called Hiding the Elephant, and Thomas Tobin was an important part of that story. And when I came to write about Thomas Tobin, I knew the name, I knew what he'd done, and I got all the great books of magic out, and I started reading about Thomas Tobin, and I started reading the same sentence over and over and over again, 2 sentences. He was trained as a chemist and an architect, and he worked with Professor Pepper at the Polytechnic, and it was done. And there was nothing else no other information. And that's the worst thing you can see as an author, is that everyone's written the same thing about something. Because that means there's no other information. So that started the thinking about Thomas W. Tobin. So an inventive young man from Victorian London, Thomas William Tobin, left us with a number of astonishing, puzzling mysteries, and that was his intention. And he also left us with one more perplexing, nagging mystery, and that was a mistake. That is a twist of history that left our history books incomplete until this afternoon. So although we're standing in a cemetery, it is a beautiful historic cemetery, and it's satisfying that today we are finally allowed to put together all those mysteries, to solve them, and finally celebrate the life and career of Thomas William Tobin 135 years after his death. He was born in 1843 in London, England. He might have been born in the very beginning of 1844. There's some discrepancy between that, but we picked 43 as probably the most likely year. He studied at the Charterhouse School of Government Schools of Mines, and when he was just 10 years old, he was apprenticed to the offices of a chemist. That's important. And when he was 14, he was apprenticed to the offices of an architect, and that's also important. When he was 15 years old, he discovered a new way of mixing the gases for the oxyhydrogen lamp, which was a new invention in Victorian London. And this discovery brought him to the attention of show business professionals, because the oxyhydrogen lamp was commonly known as the limelight. It was the first commercial spotlight, and it was the light that allowed performers to be seen brightly on stage for the first time. And it was also used in projectors, like the projecting microscope that was being exhibited at the London Polytechnic, which was a science museum on Regent Street in London. Now, the London Polytechnic was managed by a very curious man by the name of John Henry Pepper. He also was a chemist and a showman. He was a sort of P.T. Barnum of London in those days. And at the Polytechnic, audiences were lured inside of this museum, this sensational museum, with a hodgepodge of various exhibits, including a brick-making machine, a diving bell, travel log, lectures, science demonstrations, and shows about the microorganisms that lived inside a drop of pond water. That's where the projecting microscope came in. The Polytechnic also displayed a display of wax figures depicting the resurrection. So you could go and see just about anything at this museum. Tobin was fascinated by the museum when he was a young man, and he was flattered by Pepper, who needed his help. In 1862, Pepper had just contracted to display a brand new special effect in his theater at the London Polytechnic. It was, unbelievably, a scene in which ghosts could appear on stage with living actors. That is, transparent figures that were moving around like ghosts would actually be on the stage with real actors. And the public came to know it as Pepper's Ghost, and it was an absolutely incredible effect. It was a sensation for a number of years in London. Now, the secret of Pepper's Ghost was a very careful use of a big sheet of clear glass to reflect images. And in conjunction with the oxyhydrogen lamp, this very bright light, they could cause a reflection of an actor in white to appear as a ghost, a kind of transparent image on stage with other actors. But when he had a chance to study the secret, Thomas Tobin also realized that his training as an architect would be of use. He was fascinated by the use of reflections on stage, and he was able to very easily calculate the angles and the sight lines of the audience, which is really how these illusions get planned. So just over 2 years later, when he was not yet 20, Tobin and Pepper introduced their own illusion, when he was just over 20, I should say. Tobin and Pepper introduced their own illusion on the stage of the Polytechnic. On April 10th, 1865, they presented a trick called Proteus, or We Are Here, But Not Here. So what would you have seen if you would have seen Proteus at the Polytechnic? Proteus was the very first magic cabinet trick. It was a 6-foot-tall cabinet, kind of like a big armoire, and it was opened and showed empty, and then it was turned around, and then the doors were closed, and it was opened again just a few seconds later, and there was a person standing inside. Now, that might not sound very elaborate today, and it certainly isn't very elaborate if you had seen a show like Lance's in Las Vegas, but that was the very first of those tricks. Magicians had never done anything like that before, and even more important, magicians had never used those optical secrets on stage. Magic was something called conjuring. They were mechanical secrets, or it was sleight of hand. And suddenly, Professor Pepper and Thomas W. Tobin had a whole new arsenal of secrets, optical illusions on the stage. So, by using silvered mirrors on the stage, which was Tobin's creation, he was able to carefully arrange the angles in the cabinet and the reflections of the scenery, and he could actually make someone invisible on stage. He could make them appear or disappear. And rather than explain that secret in detail, I will note that a number of us here are professional magicians, and now we stop talking. Because we are still using those principles today, believe it or not, and we are hiding them from you in incredible new ways. But you should know that when you hear people say, it's all done with mirrors, that's who they're talking about. That's the person that did it for the first time, and that's the person that made it popular. He followed it up just months later with an astonishing illusion, which was premiered at Egyptian Hall, which single-handedly made the career of an amazing showman named Colonel Stodare. It was called the Sphinx, and the Sphinx was a living head on a wooden table. A table where there was no drapery around it at all. You could see that the table was only an inch thick, and on top of the table was the head of a person who recited a piece of poetry. It was a complete sensation in London. It brought people to Egyptian Hall. One of the great fans of the Sphinx who speculated about how it was done and was wrong was Charles Dickens. Just shortly after that, Tobin introduced a new trick back at the Polytechnic. This was called the Modern Delphic Oracle, and this was a living head that floated on stage, over the stage, and spoke to the audience. And then, shortly after that, another trick called the Enchanted Casket, which was a glass box that appeared to be empty and suddenly became filled with various objects. Now, you might hear all of these vaguely as a little like the magic tricks that you've seen over the years, and you'd be completely right, because magicians have used these tricks and these principles and changed them and added to them, and I plead guilty to that as well. All of these have been important parts of our arsenal, and it's all because of the work that Thomas Tobin did before he turned 22 years old. He was still in his early 20s. He'd invented 4 of the most important illusions in modern magic, and he pioneered a whole new form of magic. He'd inspired magicians like Colonel Stodare and John Neville Maskelyne, who were just starting their career, and he went over to Paris and had a session, which is what magicians call it today, with a magician named Jean Robert Houdin, the greatest magician of the 19th century, the father of modern magic, who was a complete fan of Thomas Tobin's work and wrote about it when he was in retirement. His tricks were literally used by hundreds, perhaps thousands of magicians. Shortly after that, Tobin, who was not a showman himself, he went to work for a jewelry house in London because he was a very talented artist and designer, and he was sent to Africa to examine a diamond field. He returned fascinated with the story of diamonds, and he presented lectures all about these dazzling gems. In 1872, he teamed up with Professor Pepper again, presenting a number of scientific lectures and optical illusions. One of these was a brand new illusion that he had created called Telo-Genesis, or, as it was billed on the playbills, the destruction and phoenix-like reproduction of a living being before an audience. In this trick, a man stood up inside of a cabinet, his head was cut off, an arm was cut off, a leg was cut off as you were watching, and then he was restored once again to life. Once again, maybe this sounds familiar, and that's because we've been doing versions of this ever since it was first introduced in 1872. Now, that science show was not a success in London, but the partners decided to pool their resources and move the show to America. So, they put everything on a boat, they brought it over to America, and they started touring from the East Coast, working their way west. It was not a success. It was a very difficult show to tour because they had a lot of big apparatus, and it depended on, as I told you, sheets of large glass, which was very delicate and very costly whenever they got to a new town. So they appeared in several cities, and they finally wound up in Louisville. Now, for Professor Pepper, who was a very successful showman in London, he didn't like it. He had run out of money, he wasn't charmed by Louisville, and he wanted to get back. So he sold the apparatus that he had for $700, he got back on a boat, and he went back to London. And that's where the magic world lost track of Thomas William Tobin. Gone. They were all using his inventions, but no one knew what happened to this 20-year-old man. And the answer was, he loved Louisville. His health was not good. The climate here was fantastic. The people were wonderful. It was green. It was verdant. There were scientists around at the university. And he befriended a number of Kentucky colonels. And back then, they really were Kentucky colonels. It was right after the Civil War. And he teamed up with a Colonel Young, who was very interested in starting a polytechnic institution in Louisville, a sort of science museum and school to teach science. But Tobin hadn't completely given up on show business. He traveled to New York, and he went on the stage again, and he gave lectures for P.T. Barnum at Barnum's Coliseum at Broadway and 35th Street. And this photo was taken just across the street at a photo studio across the street from the Coliseum. And there, Tobin demonstrated his optical illusions for another season, and after a season with Barnum, he was hired to appear with Alexander Herman, who was America's greatest magician at that time. He worked one season with Herman performing the Frankenstein mystery, which was his new name for Telo-Genesis, or the man that was cut up and put back together again. So after appearances with Herman and lectures on spiritualism, he returned to Louisville to work for his friend Colonel Young. And Young, looking for somewhere to put his young ward, Thomas Tobin, recommended that he be the chair and professor of chemistry at Central Kentucky University in Richmond. And that's where he ended up. And of course, now Central Kentucky University is Eastern Kentucky University. So in 1877, Tobin built an amazing new invention, now a complete science invention called the Sine Pendulum, which was an intricately designed piece of scientific apparatus to demonstrate the rotation of the Earth. It looked a lot like a surveyor's transom. And it was a beautiful piece of apparatus that was exhibited at the World's Fair in Paris in 1878. But the problem with the pendulum was it was lost. When it was put back on the ship to come back to Louisville, the ship sunk, which is what used to happen in those days, and the Sine Pendulum was lost. Amazingly, 1 month later, another ship found it floating in the middle of the Atlantic in its case, and it was identified when they cleaned off the plates on it and saw who it was made for. So the case arrived back in Louisville. Professor Tobin restored the apparatus, and the apparatus now is in the collection of Eastern Kentucky University. Tobin also experimented with a new invention that he'd read about called the telephone. And you might be surprised to hear that he established an exchange in the city of Louisville with a number of phones. It was one of the first cities in America to actually be wired for the telephone. The only problem was Bell's invention was protected by a patent, and they sued the people of Louisville to get those telephones removed. So Tobin's phones were ripped out, and several years later Bell's phones were put in. You missed it by that much. From the sublime to the ridiculous, right around the same time, he achieved some fame in the city of Louisville by being able to draw a little drawing of an X inside of a square, inside of a circle, without lifting his pencil from the paper. We still don't know how he did it, Mathematicians will tell you to this day that drawing that figure is completely impossible without lifting your pencil from the paper. However, many people saw Tobin do it, and they were convinced that they could do it themselves. I think this might have been a little more sleight of hand than mathematics, but somehow he managed to do it, and you can still read those articles about Thomas Tobin and the Tobin puzzle, which was the rage of Louisville in 1877. I'm sorry, in the early 1880s. In 1883, Tobin was struck, unfortunately, with consumption, which was the old term for pulmonary tuberculosis. He had already lost other members of his family to exactly that disease, so we know that they were prone to that. He was just 41 years old at that time. He died on August 4th, 1883. There was no family, and he was buried here at Cave Hill in an unmarked grave, as Lance said. The irony of Tobin's career is that his friends and scientific associates in Louisville probably never fully understood his importance to the field of magic and optical illusions. And maybe that's because Professor Tobin, now that he'd become a scientist, didn't really talk about those show business days, or he tossed them all off with a shrug. Or maybe he never really understood the impact he had on magic, because at that time, a number of important London magicians were still using all his inventions, and he was now a long distance from London. As for the magicians, they had completely lost track of Tobin. A man that we all revere named John Neville Maskelyne took credit for all those inventions in the Encyclopedia Britannica because the inventor had disappeared. Magicians are very tricky guys. Now we're setting the record straight. It wasn't Maskelyne who was Tobin. Magicians continue to use his inventions today. And Thomas gave us a toolbox of incredible optical illusions, and he completely changed the world of magic by changing what magicians could do on stage. So if all this seems old-fashioned to you, a head on a table or a person appearing in a box, and it's not very interesting, I'll just remind you that 30 years after Tobin's death, there was another form of entertainment that took the world by storm in America. They were called motion pictures. And the very first motion pictures integrated a number of secrets taken directly from the world of magicians. The optical bench and superimposed images, the basis of films from King Kong to The Greatest Story Ever Told to Blade Runner, all the effects that were done before the digital age utilized the mirror illusions pioneered by Professor Thomas Tobin on stage. You can still read about that online. The special effects industry called them glass shots, and they were, in effect, miniature versions of exactly the illusions that he had done at Egyptian Hall in London. So it's been a shame that Tobin was allowed to disappear for almost 150 years, and it's with some satisfaction that we're able to celebrate his life and thank him for the wonderful mysteries that he's given so many audiences over the years. And it was a son of Louisville, Lance Burton, and I would say, having worked with him, a remarkably inventive magician himself, who understood the significance of Thomas Tobin's quiet presence here, unexpectedly, at Cave Hill Cemetery. So I want to thank Lance for arranging today for the invitation to speak. And thanks to all of you for being here and for a few minutes devoted to the memory of an old showman and scientist. So I want to say on behalf of hundreds of inventive magicians, and I want to mention these names because they deserve to be put right next to Thomas Tobin. Men like Charles Mort, John Neville Maskelyne, David Devant, Guy Jarrett, Howard Thurston, Gustav Fasola, Cyril Yetma, P.T. Selbit, and in this generation, Lance Burton, and he's here with us today. I want to offer official thanks to Thomas Tobin. Many great magicians have benefited from his creativity. Many audiences have been thrilled to these achievements. And today, I finally have the pleasure of explaining that Thomas Tobin started it all. Thank you.
Gina, thank you so much. I learned more about Tobin right than the 10 minutes than I've known all my whole life. I did one little quick story on my last television special, On the Road, which aired here on WHAS like 3 weeks ago. I opened an illusion with an appearing bus. So the guy that came up with the idea of the effect was Fielding, my buddy over here. He came up with this idea that I pull a piece of paper, and there was a picture painted on of a tunnel, and then a bus comes breaking through the tunnel. So that was his. Fielding came up with the effect. Then Jim and I started talking about it, and we kind of came up with the method. Fielding had a method, but we came up with a different method. And then we were out in the dry lake bed shooting this thing, and it was really windy that day. So I start to pull the paper across on it, and the wind catches it and just rips the paper in half. So we're like, gee, that didn't work, did it? So I go back in the trailer. They're putting makeup on me, and Jim and I are sitting there. Now the executive producer, Greg Sills, come in. He looks at me and says, so the trick doesn't work, right? And I go, no, don't worry. Jim and I are going to fix it, Greg. And I look, and Jim looks at me like, we're gonna fix it. That's right. So we go out, and then all we did was just sort of turn the whole illusion so that I pulled the paper out with the wind, so it wasn't like a sail, and then it worked. So there's a quick little story. But thank you so much. I'm so excited. And by the way, that illusion is also based on the work of Thomas Tobin. So you guys saw some of his work. That illusion was like a great grandson of Thomas Tobin's work. So anyway, here we are, the moment of truth. We have this beautiful monument that you guys from Cave Hill put together, and let's introduce it to the world. Jim, you want to come over here?
You know what? You're good at pulling balls.
And I just point out, first of all, if you can't read it from the back, it says Thomas William Tobin, 1844, London, England, to 1883, Louisville, Kentucky, chemist, lecturer, architect, magician, inventor, Polynesia, Sphinx illusion, Oracle of Delphi, the Cabinet of Proteus. Those are his inventions. And up here at the top is a Sphinx, a winged Sphinx, which I was really happy when Bruce called and said we got this Sphinx to go on the monument to go with the Sphinx illusion. So there is the monument, and in just a few minutes we'll have some photo ops. We do want to get some pictures with the Cave Hill folks, and we want to get some pictures with the Louisville Magic Club for the linking ring. We want to get a group shot. But before we do that, let me take care of this one little piece of business. So when Thomas Tobin was buried here in Cave Hill Cemetery in 1883, I do not think his friends and colleagues were aware of his previous life in show business or of his stature among the magicians of the world. For that reason, we can assume that no one performed the broken wand ceremony at his memorial service. We may be 135 years late, but I would like to rectify that oversight now. For thousands of years, the magician's power has been symbolized by the magic wand. The wand is used in many of the classics in magic, like the cups and balls. And there are technical reasons why we use the wand. The trick is better with the wand. But more importantly, the wand is a symbol of the magician's power. The wand is the embodiment of the magician's power. It is something tangible that we can see and touch. It has no meaning without the magician to wield it. Without the magician, the wand is powerless, it is meaningless, it is useless. We break the wand to symbolize the passing of the magician from this world into the next. We break the wand to remind us what magic is really about. It is not about the props or sleight of hand techniques or music cues. Magic is about people. How we touch people, how we share our gifts with people, how we love people. Thomas William Tobin changed the art of magic. He touched us, he shared his gifts with us, he loved us, and for that today we give thanks. And now, ladies and gentlemen, with our closing benediction, would you please welcome past president of the Louisville Magic Club and my good friend David Gerard.
This is certainly an unusual and unique experience for me and perhaps for you. Through the years, I have stood in many cemeteries, and I have prayed many prayers. And so this setting is not unusual. It's also not unusual for some time to pass between the death of a person and their memorial ceremony. But 135 years? This is a first. This is a first. Beyond what we have heard today and what I have read in Jim's wonderful books, I really don't know a lot about Thomas Tobin. I certainly don't know anything about whether or not he was a man of faith. I don't know anything about whether he had a relationship with God, if any. But here's what I believe. I believe that God made Thomas Tobin. And I believe that God loved Thomas Tobin, just as I believe God made and loves each one of us. I believe that God's love and God's goodness and God's grace is available to all of us. And because of that, I believe that death is not a dead end, but a doorway. So with those thoughts in mind, let's pray. God, there is no one like you, majestic in holiness, awesome in power, working wonders. No one can do what you can do, not even the greatest magicians in the world. You are the giver of life, the source of all wisdom and knowledge and goodness. And for that, this afternoon, we say thanks. We are here to remember and honor one of our forefathers in magic, Thomas Tobin, and to give thanks for the many contributions he has made to the art of magic. As we remember him and his life, make us mindful also of the mysterious opportunity that is our own life and the certainty of our own death. You certainly knew Thomas Tobin a lot better than any of us. When he made these amazing discoveries that have changed magic in so many ways, you already knew those secrets because you created the world in which they could exist and be discovered. And so for that, we also say thank you. As we search for ways to keep Thomas Tobin's legacy alive and to honor him beyond this beautiful monument that has been placed today, may we mirror your love to everyone around us, reflecting your goodness and your grace into the dark places of our world through the magic that we do, but even more importantly, through the lives that we live. This is my prayer. Amen.
Thanks for coming out, everybody. We appreciate you being here to honor Thomas Tobin. That is the end of our scheduled events.